The mission folder didn't just hit the table. It skittered across the polished surface like a dying bird, its pages fluttering before it finally came to rest at the far edge. The sound was a sharp, staccato crack that cut through the low hum of the air conditioning and the quiet murmurs of 14 seasoned operators. The room went dead silent. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a fistfight or a court-martial. Lieutenant Jack Mercer, a man who looked like he had been carved out of a single block of granite and granite alone, didn't look at the folder. He didn't look at the other men. He pointed one thick, calloused finger directly at Specialist Emily Carter's face, his eyes narrowed into slits of icy blue. He told them to get that thing out of his briefing room. Not the specialist, not the operator, not even her rank. Just that thing. To Mercer, and to the room full of Tier 1 operators, Emily Carter was an anomaly that didn't belong in their ecosystem. She stood exactly 4 feet, 9 inches tall. On her back, she carried a rifle system that was nearly as long as she was tall, a weapon capable of reaching out and ending a life from over 2 miles away. The juxtaposition was almost comical to them, a tiny woman in a world of giants, carrying the ultimate equalizer. When Mercer made the comment, the silence didn't last long. It broke into a wave of laughter that rolled through the room, a collective, booming derision from 14 armed men who had decided before she even spoke that she was a mistake. Every single one of them laughed like it was the funniest moment of their careers. They saw a mascot, not a peer. They saw a liability, not a lifeline. Before we go any further into this story of defiance and survival, if this is your first time here, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. You're going to want to follow this story all the way to its brutal, narrow end. While you're at it, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the map. Now, let's get back into the desert heat. The transport aircraft had touched down on the tarmac at 0412 hours, the wheels screaming against the baked asphalt of the forward operating base. The first sign that things were going to be difficult wasn't the heat or the mission profile. It was the fact that nobody came to meet her. In the world of special operations, even for a support attachment or a specialist, protocol and basic military courtesy dictated that someone should be at the landing pad. You sent a junior enlisted with a vehicle, or a corpsman, or even just a tired kid with a clipboard to show the new arrival where they fit. But when the ramp of the C-130 dropped, Emily Carter stepped out into the dry, fuel-scented night alone. She stood there for a full 30 seconds, her ruck nearly as wide as her shoulders, the heavy sniper system case strapped across her back, forcing her to lean forward just to keep her center of gravity from toppling her. The desert night hit her like a physical wall, dry, cold, and smelling of sand and spent jet engines. The only welcome she received was the fading whine of the aircraft's turbines and the distant, flickering floodlights of the FOB throwing long, distorted shadows across the dirt. She adjusted the straps of her gear, felt the familiar ache in her shoulders, and began the long walk toward the lights by herself. Emily was 26 years old, but she carried herself with the weary weight of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. She had been shooting competitively since she was 9. Her grandfather, a Vietnam-era Marine sniper who always smelled faintly of motor oil and burnt black coffee, had been the one to hand her a .22 rifle in a dusty field outside Latch, Texas. He hadn't told her she was pretty or talented. He had told her that patience was the most dangerous weapon ever invented. At 9 years old, she had believed him because he was the only person who didn't look at her size as a limitation. Now, years later, she believed him more than ever. She had grown up small, and she had stayed small. She was the kind of small that made pediatricians look at their charts with a frown and made store clerks offer her the children's menu well into her 20s. At 4'9" and 112 pounds, Emily had been forced to fight for every single inch of ground the Army had ever given her. She had fought for every qualification, every advanced school, and every handshake that wasn't dripping with condescension. She was intimately familiar with the look, the moment someone in a room decided she didn't belong. It was a look she had seen in recruiting offices at the range, and now at the gate of a forward operating base in the middle of a conflict zone. It still cut, but the scar tissue was thick enough now that she didn't bleed. The gate guard at the entrance of the FOB gave her that exact look. He held her ID card, looked at her, looked back at the card, and then looked at her again as if he were trying to solve a complex math problem that simply didn't add up. He finally asked if she was the sniper attachment, his voice trailing off into a tone of pure skepticism. When she confirmed, he handed the card back with a long, pregnant pause and told her the briefing had already started. She checked her watch, 0427. The brief wasn't scheduled until 0500. They had moved the time up and intentionally left her out of the loop. She filed that information away in the quiet, cold place behind her eyes where she kept everything designed to make her feel small. She didn't get angry, she got focused. When she opened the door to the briefing room, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, coffee, and the electric tension of an impending op. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when something truly unexpected walks through the door. It wasn't the polite silence of surprise. It was the heavy, evaluating quiet of a pack of wolves looking at a stray cat. 14 men, mostly Navy SEALs, a couple of Army Rangers, and a CIA liaison all turned to stare. Their expressions were a unified verdict. This is a mistake. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Jack Mercer. He was the quintessential operator, 6'2", built with the rugged efficiency of a man who viewed his own body as a piece of military hardware. His jaw was a block of granite, and his eyes were the color of a winter sea, devoid of anything resembling softness. He had 11 combat deployments and a Silver Star. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life being right, and that record of success had grown into a pride so thick you couldn't tell where the confidence ended and the arrogance began. He looked at Emily the way a master mechanic looks at a compact car that has been brought in for a heavy-duty trucking job. She tried to apologize for being late, explaining she hadn't been notified of the time change. Mercer didn't even acknowledge the oversight. He just told her the mission window was tightening and ordered her to sit down. As she moved toward an empty seat, the whispers started. Someone behind her muttered, "A sniper," just loud enough for the whole room to hear. Then came the voice of Chief Petty Officer Darius Wade, a man built like a refrigerator and decorated with enough combat ribbons to resemble a Christmas tree. With a lazy, unhurried ease, he remarked that she looked like someone's kid sister. The room erupted in easy, comfortable laughter. These were men who didn't fear consequences because they were the ones who handed them out. Emily didn't look at Wade. She didn't look at any of them. She opened her mission folder, smoothed the pages flat, and began to absorb the data. The mission was a hostage rescue. 2 American aid workers had been snatched by a militant cell operating in the jagged desert mountains 60 kilometers south of the border. Intel indicated the hostages were being moved every 48 to 72 hours to avoid detection. The window for extraction was razor thin. Mercer's planned approach involved moving the team through a deep canyon system. To the planners, it looked perfect: natural cover, minimal traffic, and excellent concealment for a stealthy approach. But as Emily pored over the topographic overlays, something began to gnaw at her. She read the maps once, twice, and then a third time, her mind's eye visualizing the three-dimensional space of the canyon. She saw the north wall. She saw the ridge overhangs that occurred at 200-meter intervals of elevation. She realized that Mercer's route would place the entire team directly beneath those overhangs for 4 kilometers of movement. It was a tactical nightmare. She raised her hand. Mercer looked at her as if she were a student who had interrupted a doctoral lecture to ask where the bathroom was. When she pointed out the danger of the ridge lines and the potential for elevated hostile positioning, Mercer's dismissal was surgical. He told her they had reviewed the intel, which was based on aerial imagery from 72 hours ago. Emily tried to counter, mentioning that the shifting wind patterns and local terrain suggested the intel might be stale, but Mercer cut her off. He spoke slowly, with the exaggerated pronunciation one uses for a child, reminding her that his team had 43 successful operations under their belts. He told her that when he wanted her input on the approach, he would ask for it. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Wade, sitting to her right, leaned back in his chair and looked at her with a look that was almost sympathetic, the way you might feel sorry for a person about to trip and fall on a stage. Emily simply said, "Understood, sir," and went back to her folder. But her thumb stayed on that topographic overlay. She couldn't stop thinking about the ridges, the stale photographs, and the wind. She saw the trap even if they refused to acknowledge it. When the briefing ended at 0553, Mercer began assigning roles. Point, slack, team leader, support, rear security. He called out the names with crisp precision. He didn't say her name. When he was finished, Emily asked about her position in the formation. Mercer looked at her with a deliberate, casual cruelty. He told her she would be behind the main element, the very last position before the rear security. In the language of combat, that meant she wasn't part of the team. She was cargo. She was a piece of luggage being hauled along. "My operational profile is long-range precision support," Emily said, her voice a flat, even line. She explained that she needed to be ahead of the element, establishing elevated positions to overwatch their movement. Mercer's response was a hammer blow. "You'll be where I need you, which is somewhere you won't slow us down." The sentence hung in the air like a heavy fog. Wade let out a small, suppressed huff of a laugh. Emily didn't react. She counted to 3 in the dark space of her mind, said, "Copy that, sir," and stood up to leave. She didn't let the anger show. She had learned long ago that you can't truly put away an insult like that, so she just stored it in a shelf in her mind where it wouldn't interfere with the mission. She had work to do. At the equipment bay, the young quartermaster stared at her as she listed her gear requirements. The Barrett M107 system, the full setup. He warned her it weighed 68 pounds. Emily just gave him a pleasant, thin smile and told him she'd been carrying it for 3 years. She spent the next 90 minutes alone, meticulously cleaning every component of the massive rifle. She checked every setting, verified every round of ammunition, and built her loadout with the calculated economy of someone who knew exactly how much weight their body could endure. Every ounce was a choice. As she worked, her mind kept drifting back to Hill 350. It was a massive, near-vertical spire of shale and granite that sat 800 meters east of the canyon route. To the rest of the team, it was just a mountain, a piece of scenery that wasn't on the path. But to Emily, it was the high ground. From that summit, 3,500 meters above the desert floor, a shooter could see the entire canyon system. It was the only place that could counter the ridge lines. She went to find Wade one last time. She found him by the vehicles and asked for 5 minutes of honest conversation. To his credit, Wade saw something in her eyes that made him signal his teammates to give them space. She laid it out for him, the overlapping fields of fire in the canyon, the lack of an extraction route, and the death trap Mercer was walking them into. She asked him why nobody was speaking up. Wade looked at her for a long time, and for a second she saw a flicker of respect. But then he sighed and told her that the lieutenant had made the call. He had the intel and he had the record. Wade told her that if she was wrong, her career would end that night. But then he paused and added, "If you're right, you better just be right." It wasn't an endorsement, it was a warning. At 0715, the convoy was staged and ready to move. The desert morning was beginning to bleed into a deep indigo. Mercer walked the line, performing final checks. When he got to Emily, his only question was whether she could keep pace. Not if she was ready, but if she could keep up. He told her that if she fell behind, she would stay behind. Emily looked him in the eye and told him she understood. As the convoy rolled south, Emily watched the mountain range emerge from the shadows. Hill 350 looked like a jagged, angry tooth against the horizon. She looked at the canyon, the dark slash in the earth where the men were headed, and she looked at the mountain. She had followed orders her entire career, even when those orders were wrong or meant to diminish her. She believed in the system. But she also believed in those 14 men who were about to walk into a kill zone, and she believed in her grandfather's voice telling her that patience was a weapon. When the convoy reached the dismount point, the SEALs filed out with their characteristic, quiet efficiency. Emily stepped off the vehicle, looked at the formation disappearing into the canyon, and then she looked east. She made her choice. There was no surge of adrenaline, only the cold weight of the decision. She knew that by turning away from the team, she was likely throwing away her entire future in the military. She knew Mercer would crucify her, but she also knew that if she stayed behind the formation as cargo, she would be useless when the shooting started. She turned away from the canyon and toward the mountain. She was alone in the dark with 68 pounds on her back and a sandstorm brewing on the horizon. She didn't look back. She just started to climb. The first 11 minutes of the ascent were a test of pure willpower. Her left hand slipped on a patch of shale worn smooth by eons of wind. It wasn't a dramatic fall, but her weight shifted, and the heavy Barrett case on her back swung like a pendulum, threatening to pull her off the rock face. She jammed her fingers into a crack, the stone biting into her skin, and held on until the world stopped spinning. She breathed, regained her footing, and kept going. She was already 300 meters up, and the convoy below was gone, swallowed by the gray dawn. The rifle was her true adversary. The Barrett system in its hard case was 32 pounds of dead weight. With the ammo, the spotting scope, and her ruck, she was carrying nearly 70 pounds on a 4'9" frame. The physics were brutal. The weight wanted to pull her spine backward to torque her body away from the rock. Every handhold was a victory of muscle over gravity. At 22 minutes, she reached the first ridge and collapsed for 30 seconds. She wasn't resting. She was just lowering her heart rate so she could think. The wind was changing now. She knew that sound, the restless, probing wind of a West Texas desert before a storm. The sandstorm she had warned Mercer about was coming, and it was going to hit sooner than the intel had predicted. She had 90 minutes to reach the summit and establish a position before the visibility vanished. She started climbing faster, her fingers bleeding and her lungs burning. Every meter she gained was a meter closer to the only vantage point that mattered. Below her, in the shadows of the canyon, 14 men were moving deeper into a trap. Above her, the summit of Hill 350 was a dark, silent promise. She didn't care about the court-martial anymore. She didn't care about Mercer's pride. She only cared about the high ground and the patience she had been practicing since she was 9 years old. The climb became a rhythmic blur of pain and calculation. The second ridge line was steeper, a near-vertical chimney of granite that forced her to wedge her body into a narrow crack and shimmy upward. The Barrett case scraped against the rock, the sound of metal on stone echoing like a heartbeat. Her legs were trembling, the lactic acid screaming in her quads, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. As she cleared the chimney, the sky began to turn a bruised, dusty orange. The sandstorm was no longer a distant threat. It was a wall of grit rising on the horizon. The wind began to howl, picking up fine grains of sand that stung her eyes and clogged her throat. She pulled a shemagh over her face and kept moving. She was at 3,000 meters now. The air was thinning, and every breath felt like she was inhaling needles. She reached the summit plateau at 84 minutes. Her body felt like it was made of lead, and her hands were raw, but she didn't stop to celebrate. She moved to the western edge of the plateau, where the mountain dropped away into a sheer cliff overlooking the canyon system. She took a breath, stabilized her shaking hands, and began to unpack the rifle. The Barrett M107 was a beast of a weapon, a semi-automatic, 50 caliber monster designed to disable vehicles and penetrate armor. In the hands of a master, it was a surgical tool of incredible range. Emily assembled the bipod, checked the bore, and began to dial in her optics. The wind was gusting, but she had spent her life learning to read the air. She calculated the density, the temperature, and the Coriolis effect of the high altitude. Down in the canyon, 4 kilometers away, she saw them. They were tiny, dark shapes moving in a staggered line through the base of the gorge. They were exactly where the topographic map said they would be, deep in the belly of the canyon, with the North Ridge lines hanging over them like the lid of a coffin. And then she saw the other movement. On the North Ridge, 200 meters above the SEAL team, figures were moving. They weren't soldiers in uniform. They were shadows in robes, carrying RPGs and PKM machine guns. They were moving into the overlapping firing positions Emily had identified in the briefing. They had the high ground, the cover, and the element of surprise. They were waiting for the team to reach the kill box, a narrow bend in the canyon where there was no cover and no way out. Emily lay prone on the cold stone of Hill 350, the Barrett stock tucked into her shoulder. She felt the weight of the rifle, the stability of the bipod, and the sudden, crystalline calm that always came when she was behind the glass. The world narrowed down to the crosshairs. She wasn't a thing anymore. She wasn't a mistake or a kid sister. She was the only person in the world who could see what was about to happen and the only person who could stop it. She watched through the high-powered optic as the lead element of the SEAL team with Mercer at the front approached the bend. The militants on the ridge were raising their weapons. An RPG gunner was kneeling, taking aim at the lead vehicle. Emily adjusted her dial for the 4-kilometer shot, a distance that most snipers wouldn't even attempt. She felt the wind against her cheek, felt the rhythm of her own heart, and waited. Patience, her grandfather had said, was the most dangerous weapon. She took a long, slow breath, let half of it out, and held. The world went still. The sandstorm was closing in, the first veils of dust beginning to obscure the canyon floor. She had one chance before the visibility was gone. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, a thunderous crack that shook the very ground she lay on. A massive muzzle flash bloomed in the dim light, and the heavy, 50 caliber round punched through the air at supersonic speeds. 4 kilometers away, the RPG gunner on the ridge didn't even hear the shot. He simply disintegrated as the massive round struck him in the chest, the force of the impact throwing his body backward off the cliff. Down in the canyon, the sound of the shot arrived seconds later, echoing off the walls like a clap of thunder. The SEAL team scrambled for cover, their heads snapping upward toward the ridge. They didn't know where the shot had come from, but they knew what it meant. The ambush had been triggered early. Emily didn't wait. She worked the bolt, the heavy brass casing clattering onto the rocks, and found her next target. A machine gunner was opening fire on the team below. She adjusted for the gusting wind and fired again. The PKM position went silent as the gunner was swept away by the sheer kinetic energy of the round. On the canyon floor, Mercer was shouting orders, his team returning fire toward the ridges, but they were pinned. They were shooting uphill against an enemy they could barely see. But from Hill 350, Emily saw everything. She became a vengeful god, raining down heavy precision fire from a distance the militants couldn't even comprehend. Every time a muzzle flash appeared on the ridge, she extinguished it. The sandstorm hit then, a wall of brown grit that swallowed the canyon and the mountain. The visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. Emily couldn't see the team anymore, and she couldn't see the militants. She sat back from the rifle, her chest heaving, the taste of sand in her mouth. She had bought them time. She had broken the ambush and given them a fighting chance to find cover before the storm locked everyone in place. She stayed on the summit for the next 6 hours as the storm raged. She huddled behind a rock outcropping, wrapped in her thermal blanket, listening to the scream of the wind. She didn't know if the team had survived. She didn't know if they had made it to the extraction point. All she knew was that she had done her job. She had been right. When the storm finally broke at mid-afternoon, the desert was a transformed landscape. The air was unnervingly still and clear. Emily packed her gear, her movements slow and mechanical from exhaustion. She began the long, punishing descent down the eastern face of the mountain. Her body was screaming, her knees buckling with every step, but she kept moving. She reached the desert floor as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. She saw the dust clouds first, then the silhouettes of the vehicles. The convoy was moving back toward the base, but they weren't moving fast. They were battered, their vehicles pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel. As she walked toward the road, the lead vehicle slowed to a crawl and then stopped. The door opened and Lieutenant Mercer stepped out. He looked different. His gear was shredded, his face was smeared with dried blood and grit, and the ironclad certainty that usually radiated from him was gone. He looked at Emily, truly looked at her, as she stood there, covered in dust, the massive Barrett case still strapped to her back. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there in the middle of the road, the wind whistling through the quiet. Then he looked up at the towering peak of Hill 350 and back down at the 4'9" woman standing before him. Behind him, the rest of the team was watching from the trucks. Wade was there, leaning out of a window, a strange, grim smile on his face. Mercer walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. He looked at the blood on her hands and the exhaustion in her eyes. He reached out not to point a finger, but to take the heavy ruck from her shoulders. "Specialist," he said, his voice raspy and low. There was no mockery in it. There was no thing or kid sister. There was only the heavy, sober weight of a man who had been saved by the very person he had tried to bury. "We counted 12 hostile positions on that ridge. All 12 were neutralized by precision fire from an elevated eastern position." Emily didn't smile. She didn't feel the need to gloat. She just looked at him and said, "I told you the ridge lines were a problem, sir." Mercer nodded slowly. He didn't apologize, men like him rarely did, but he handed her ruck to Wade and stood aside, holding the door of the lead vehicle open for her. "Get in the truck, Carter. We're going home." As the convoy rolled back toward the FOB, the silence in the vehicle was different than the silence in the briefing room. It wasn't the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of respect. Emily leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the mountain recede into the distance. She thought about her grandfather and the field in Latch, Texas. She thought about the weight of the rifle and the way the wind felt at 3,000 meters. She had been right. She had been patient. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Back at the base, the story began to spread before they even finished debriefing. The giants of the SEAL team spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones about the ghost on the hill, the tiny operator who had climbed a mountain in a sandstorm to save a team that hadn't even wanted her there. They looked at the Barrett case and they looked at her, and for the first time they didn't see a mascot. They saw a predator. Mercer sat across from her in the debriefing room. He didn't throw any folders this time. He just pushed a cup of hot, black coffee toward her and told her to start from the beginning. He listened to every word, every calculation, every detail of the climb. When she was finished, he sat back and looked at her for a long time. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said, the words hanging in the air. "I did, sir," Emily replied, her voice steady. "And you saved 14 lives," Mercer added. He picked up his pen and began to write. "I'll be filing the paperwork for a commendation for valor and specialist. Next time we go out, you're on point. You pick the route." Emily took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and strong, smelling of motor oil and burnt beans. It tasted like home. She looked at Mercer and gave him a small, tired nod. She didn't need the medal and she didn't need the apology. She had the high ground, and she knew with the quiet certainty of a shooter that she would never have to fight for a seat at the table again. Outside, the desert sun finally set, casting the mountains in a deep, bloody red. Hill 350 stood tall and silent, a monument to the girl who had refused to be small. The wind began to pick up again, whistling through the barracks and the hangars, carrying the scent of sand and the distant, fading memory of a battle won by patience. Emily closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had finally arrived, and this time, everyone knew exactly who she was. At 43 minutes into the ascent, the pain in her shoulders crossed the threshold from a dull, manageable discomfort into something with jagged teeth. The rifle case straps had been grinding into the same 2 points on her trapezius muscles since she had left the base of the ridge, and now those points had graduated from mere soreness to a localized, white-hot burning. It was a specific and insistent sensation that demanded total acknowledgement. She acknowledged it, processed the sensation as data, and kept climbing. In her world, pain was simply information. As long as the information the nerves were relaying was that things hurt but nothing was actually failing, she could work with it. "You are not tired," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rising whistle of the wind. She had learned this trick on long stalks and even longer climbs in the high country back home. It wasn't because she believed it entirely. Her body knew better, but because the part of her brain responsible for managing the output of effort needed to hear the lie. "You're just working," she told herself. "Keep working." The rock under her right boot crumbled without a hint of warning. Gravity took hold instantly, and she dropped 6 inches before her left foot slammed onto a narrow ledge and her hands found a desperate grip on the wall. The rifle case swung wide, its weight amplified by the sudden momentum, and for one genuine, heart-stopping moment, she was hanging by only her left foot and both hands. 68 pounds of gear and weaponry were trying to pull her backward into the empty, dark air of the canyon. She pressed her chest flat against the cold rock face, closing her eyes for a heartbeat to steady her pulse. She breathed, found a new hold for her right foot, and centered her weight. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She didn't wait for the adrenaline to fade, she just kept going. Below her, completely invisible now in the complex terrain and the weak, growing light of the early morning, the SEAL team was moving. She couldn't see them, but she didn't need to. She knew their pace. She knew their exact route. She had spent hours memorizing the topographic overlay of this region, until she could run the entire movement in her head like a high-definition film. The approach would begin at the canyon entrance at kilometer 0. From there, they would begin the long, exposed 4-kilometer movement through what she had correctly identified as a kill zone, with the north wall ridge lines towering above them the entire way. She needed to be in her final overwatch position before they reached the 2-kilometer mark. If she wasn't, they would be walking into a trap with no one to watch the high ground. She pushed harder, her lungs burning in the thinning air. At 58 minutes, she reached the base of the second vertical face and found the chimney climb she had flagged on the topo map during her preparation. It was a vertical crack in the rock, approximately 18 inches wide, running straight up for what looked like 12 meters. Chimney climbing was a specialized, grueling technique that involved pressing your back against one wall and your feet against the other, inching upward using nothing but friction and opposing pressure. Under normal circumstances, with a light day pack, it was strenuous but manageable for someone with her level of fitness. With a 40-pound rifle case strapped to her back, however, it was going to be an ordeal of a different magnitude. She stared at the crack for a moment, her breath hitching in her chest. She looked up toward the summit, still hidden in the pre-dawn gloom, and then she thought about the men in the canyon. She didn't hesitate. She wedged herself into the chimney. The case made the ascent almost impossible. There was no way to get her back flat against the stone with the bulky Barrett case sandwiched between her spine and the rock. To compensate, she had to angle one shoulder, driving it against the stone while her body twisted in an unnatural contortion. She was working up the crack in a way that bypassed standard chimney technique, loading her spine at angles that she knew would require a long, unpleasant conversation with a physical therapist somewhere in her future. She moved 6 inches at a time, a grueling cycle of press, slide, and hold. The abrasive rock scraped her forearms through the fabric of her jacket, and her boots struggled to find purchase on the slick interior of the crack. Halfway up, her left arm began to shake. This wasn't the controlled, managed fatigue of hard work. It was the deep, involuntary tremor of a muscle group reaching its absolute failure point. She had felt that specific tremor once before during a brutal training exercise in the mountains of Colorado, and her reaction now was identical to what it had been then. She registered the weakness. She assessed the remaining distance. It wasn't failure yet, just a boundary. She shifted her technique, loading her right arm more heavily to give the left a partial, momentary rest without halting her upward progress. When she finally clawed her way out of the chimney at 67 minutes, she collapsed onto the ledge above it. She lay there with her face pressed against the cold stone, both arms vibrating with exhaustion, her heart hammering a rhythm that felt entirely unsustainable. She checked her watch. She had 43 minutes left. She forced herself to stand up. The third and final face was shorter than the others, but it was considerably steeper, and the wind was becoming a serious factor. It was no longer just probing the mountainside. It was committed now, screaming out of the southwest with the particular, sudden violence of desert air that has decided on a direction. Dust and grit stung her eyes, forcing her to squint. She kept her head down and climbed more by feel than by sight, her hands reading the texture of the rock ahead of her face, while her feet sought out holds without the benefit of her eyes. At 81 minutes, 9 minutes behind the mental schedule she had set for herself, she finally pulled her body over the summit lip and onto the flat plateau at the top of Hill 350. In any other context, she might have taken a moment to appreciate the view. She was on top of the world, or at least it felt that way. But the circumstances offered no room for awe. She had 9 minutes before her time buffer was entirely gone. A sandstorm was beginning to claw at the air around the peak, the horizon disappearing into a brown haze. She had a rifle to uncase, assemble, and zero in a wind that was going to complicate every single ballistics calculation she would need to make. And somewhere below her, invisible and unreachable by radio due to the mountain's mass, 14 men were walking toward what she was increasingly certain was the final walk some of them would ever take. She dropped to the rock. With hands that were bleeding from the chimney climb, wounds she hadn't even noticed until now, she unstrapped the case. She could see the torn skin across her knuckles and the dark smears of red on the case latches, but she ignored them. She began to assemble the Barrett M82 with the automatic, fluid muscle memory of someone who had performed the task 10,000 times. She had done it in the dark, in the sub-zero cold, in the driving rain, and in every miserable condition designed to make a person fail. She had always known that when the day came to do it for real, it would not be easy. The rifle came together in exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She deployed the bipod and established her prone position, angling herself slightly to the left of the summit's highest point. She used a natural rock formation as a crude windbreak to shield her from the worst of the southwesterly gusts. Pulling her range card, she began building her firing solution, her mind working through the math with clinical precision. The canyon entrance below was visible through her high-powered scope, even through the building haze. It looked like a dark, jagged cut in the earth. As she watched, she saw them, the movement of small, rhythmic figures at the northern end. The team was at kilometer 0. They were moving south. They were moving into the trap. She pressed her eye to the scope and began a systematic scan of the north wall ridge lines. That was when she saw them. It wasn't all of them at once, but rather a slow revelation. The first one appeared as a faint heat shimmer in the glass that resolved into a shape that was definitively human. A man was lying prone on the first ridge line, holding a weapon she couldn't fully identify from this distance, but the silhouette of the long barrel was unmistakable. She shifted the scope, finding a second shape, then a third, partially concealed behind a jagged rock formation but visible to her from her superior angle. She kept scanning, finding them one by one, patient and methodical, just as her grandfather had taught her decades ago on the ridges of the Pacific Northwest. "The mountain will show you what it's hiding," he used to say, "if you're willing to be still long enough for it." She counted 8 positions on the north wall, at least 8, and she hadn't even finished her scan of the entire ridge. 8 positions with overlapping fields of fire covering the only approach route. It was exactly what she had told Lieutenant Mercer back at the base. It was exactly what he had dismissed in front of his men without a second thought. Her radio crackled, the signal on the team channel weak at this distance but still audible. She heard Mercer's voice, crisp and controlled, the voice of a man who had no idea what was waiting for him just around the next bend. He was calling for a position check from his element leaders as they crossed the 1-kilometer mark. She keyed her radio. "Mercer, this is Carter. I have eyes on hostile positions. North wall, 8 confirmed, possibly more. The canyon is a kill zone. Do not advance past kilometer 1. I say again, do not advance." Static hissed over the line, a jagged sound that tore at her nerves. Then Mercer's voice came back, sharp and hard. "Carter, where the hell are you?" "I'm at the summit of Hill 350, she replied, her voice steady despite the wind. "I have thermal and optical on 8 hostile positions covering your entire approach. They are waiting for you, Lieutenant. They know you're coming." There was a long pause on the other end, long enough for her to continue her scan. She found a 9th position, a mortar team setting up behind a secondary rock formation on the north wall, approximately 800 meters above the canyon floor. A mortar team would be a death sentence in those confined spaces. "Carter," Mercer finally said, and his tone had changed. It hadn't shifted toward belief, but toward something colder and more accusatory. "You abandoned your assigned position. You disobeyed a direct operational order. You are going to stand down immediately. You are going to get off that radio, and you are going to—" The first explosion lit up the canyon before he could finish his sentence. It wasn't a mortar round. It was an RPG fired from the 3rd position on the north wall. It slammed into the rock face 20 meters ahead of the point man, the blast enough to throw him off his feet even if the shrapnel didn't catch him. The echo reached the summit a full second after the flash, a raw, booming sound that signaled the end of the world for the men below. Then the radio erupted into a chaotic symphony of shouts and gunfire. "Contact! Contact left! RPG north wall! Cascade down! Get off the trail! Torres is hit! Torres is down! Where is it coming from? I can't see! I can't see!" The canyon had become a furnace of noise and lead. Through her scope, Emily could see the muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers along the ridge lines. She saw the white smoke trail of a second RPG streaking toward the valley floor. The SEAL team was scrambling for whatever cover the canyon offered, which was tragically little. The terrain had not been designed to protect the people moving through it. It had been designed to kill them efficiently. Mercer's voice cut through the screaming and the static, still trying to exert command over the disaster. "Suppressing fire. North wall, get me air support. Someone get me comms. LT, comms are down. The storm is killing the signal." The radio operator's voice was frantic. "Then fix it." "Sir, I can't fix physics." Emily stopped listening to the radio. She was already working. She didn't need the orders of a man who had led his team into an ambush. The mortar team was the priority. Everything else on that ridge was dangerous, but a mortar dropping high-angle rounds into that canyon would end the mission and the lives of those 14 men in under 5 minutes. The mortar team was 940 meters from her position. It was a long shot, but in the building wind, it was manageable. It wasn't a remarkable shot by her standards, but it was the only one that mattered. She dialed the elevation into her scope. She read the wind, which was now gusting between 12 and 15 knots from the southwest with unpredictable variance. She needed to wait for the brief lull between the gusts and send the round through that narrow window. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate by force of will. She found the mortar team in her glass, 3 men. One was on the tube, one was feeding rounds, and one was spotting. She picked the tube operator first. Without him, the other 2 were just men standing on a mountain. She waited. The wind screamed, then sighed. She fired. The Barrett's report hit the air like a thunderclap. The massive rifles recoiled, driving into her shoulder with familiar, brutal force. She was already cycling the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh .50 caliber round before the first bullet reached its target. It hit with devastating precision. Through the scope, she saw the mortar team's activity cease in the specific, abrupt way that life ceases when a heavy caliber round arrives without warning. She didn't pause to celebrate. She was already moving to the next target before the echo of the shot had finished crossing the canyon. The team channel erupted again, but the tone had shifted. What was that? Sniper shot? Where did that come from? North wall position 3 is down. That didn't come from the north wall. That came from above. And then Wade's voice, distinct and sharp, cut through the noise with a clarity that Emily recognized as the voice of a man who had just understood something vital. "Carter," he said. "Carter, is that you on the mountain?" She didn't answer him. She fired again. Her second target was a machine gun crew that had been pouring rhythmic bursts of fire into the canyon floor. She cycled the bolt, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency, and found the third position. Wade's voice came back, and it was different now. It wasn't questioning or commanding. It was a sound she had never heard directed at her in 7 years of military service. A sound that, if she were honest, sounded like awe. "That's Carter," he shouted to the team. "She's on the mountain. She's on top of the mountain." The hostile positions on the north wall were beginning to react to the new threat. In her scope, she saw men who had been focused entirely on the canyon floor suddenly turning, scanning the ridge line above them, trying to identify where the death was coming from. The moment they understood where she was, they would turn their weapons toward the summit, and the entire dynamic of the engagement would shift. She had a window of minutes, maybe less. She fired again, and another heat signature on the ridge went dark. Down in the canyon, the tide was beginning to turn. The volume of incoming fire from the north wall had dropped significantly. It hadn't stopped, but the overwhelming suppression had slackened enough for the team to find real cover and begin organizing. She could hear it in the radio traffic. The chaos was still there, but underneath it was the framework of trained soldiers beginning to function again. They were no longer just surviving, they were fighting back. Mercer's voice came over the air, sounding breathless. "Who is firing from elevation? Someone identify that shooter." Wade responded immediately, his voice entirely steady. "It's Carter, Lieutenant. She's on 350. She's covering our 6 from the summit." There was a silence on the radio. It only lasted 3 or 4 seconds, but it was the specific, heavy silence of a man who is being forced to revise a fundamental belief in real time. Then Mercer spoke, his voice so quiet she almost missed it through the static. "How many of them can she see?" "More than us," Wade said. "A lot more than us." Emily had her 9th target in the scope. It was their sniper, she realized, a counter-sniper positioned at the far southern end of the north wall who had been waiting for the exact moment the SEAL team's movement stalled. He was good. She could see him scanning the heights, his movements disciplined and methodical. He hadn't found her yet, but he was working toward her position with professional patience. She did not give him the time to finish his search. She fired, cycled the bolt, and then immediately dragged her rifle and her body 3 meters to the left along the summit. You always moved after a shot. Always. A good counter-sniper would orient on your muzzle flash, and you had approximately 4 seconds before his return round arrived. She was already finding her next target before she had even settled into her new position. The wind hit her like a physical wall. The sandstorm had finally arrived in earnest. This wasn't the building edge of the storm anymore. It was the main body. A wall of superheated air carrying enough particulate matter to turn the atmosphere solid, opaque, and murderous. Visibility through her optical scope dropped from clear to compromised in under 30 seconds. She reached out and flipped down the thermal attachment. Without it, she would have been blind. With it, the world became a ghost map of heat signatures, orange and red shapes against the cooler gray stone of the ridge. She heard Mercer's voice through the radio, the signal now badly broken by the interference of the storm. "Casualties? Tora's down. Kellerman, 2 wounded. Can't extract. Air support grounded. Need suppression on north wall positions 4 through 7. We cannot move 4 through 7. She found them in the thermal. The storm was making every calculation a nightmare. The wind variance had gone from manageable to impossible, gusting to 30 knots and then dropping to 10 before spiking again. Shooting in that kind of wind required more than just math. It required prediction. She had to read what the air was going to do in the 3 seconds it took for the bullet to travel from the muzzle to the target. She had to compensate not for the wind that was blowing now, but for the wind that would be blowing when the bullet arrived. It was the hardest thing she had ever attempted with a rifle. She fired anyway. Position 4 was silenced. She moved. Position 5, she sent the round and watched the heat signature drop in the thermal display. She was already moving to 6 before she even confirmed the hit. 6 was a challenge. The man was behind heavy cover, only partially exposed, and she had to wait for the exact moment he shifted his weight to engage the team below. She watched his rhythm, his interval. He was shooting every 40 seconds. She clocked 3 cycles, and on the 4th, when he rose to fire, she was already there. 4 seconds of bullet flight through a howling sandstorm. The heat signature dropped. "LT," she said into the radio, her voice steadier than she felt. "Positions 4 through 6 are down. I have 2 remaining on the north wall, working them now. What's your status?" "Static." Then Mercer came back and his voice had changed again. It wasn't the cold command voice or the dismissive certainty from the briefing room. It was something stripped of its armor. "2 Kia," he said. 3 wounded, including me. We cannot move. Kellerman is applying a tourniquet to Torres. Torres is... He paused, a silence filled with things he couldn't say. Torres is not going to make it if we don't extract in the next 20 minutes. Torres, she remembered him, the quiet one with the dark eyes and the economical movements. The one who had moved off politely when she had needed a moment with Wade at the vehicle line. "I'm working as fast as I can," Emily said. "Carter." Mercer's voice was different, just her name. "How many can you still see?" She scanned the ridge, 2 on the north wall. She swept the thermal across the far end of the ridge line and stopped. "There's a technical, a vehicle, an armed truck at the south end of the ridge. It's been staged there in reserve. It's moving now. They're repositioning it to fire directly down into your position." A long pause. "Distance?" Mercer asked. She ranged it. 1,100 meters from my position. "Can you hit a moving vehicle at 1,100 meters in this storm?" She looked at the thermal image of the truck. It was moving slowly across the jagged ridge, the heat of its engine bright and clear against the stone. It was doing maybe 15 kilometers per hour, a predictable direction. "I can hit it," she said. Another pause. Then Mercer said something she had never expected to hear from him. He said it quietly, without theater or performance, as though it were simply the truest thing he knew how to say. "Then please do." She built the solution in her head. 1,100 meters. Moving target at 15 kilometers per hour. Direction of travel was left to right across her field of view. She needed to lead the vehicle by approximately 2 meters at this wind speed. But the wind wasn't constant. It was varying between 10 and 30 knots. Her lead had to vary with it. She wasn't firing at where the truck was, and she wasn't firing at where a constant calculation said it would be. She was firing at a precise point in space where her reading of an inconsistent wind said the truck would be when a bullet that traveled for over a second finally arrived. She breathed out. She stilled her body, letting the wind buffeting her become part of the background. The wind peaked at 28 knots and began to drop. She fired. The truck's engine block detonated. It wasn't a massive explosion, but the .50 caliber round punched through the steel and iron with enough kinetic energy to catastrophically damage the block and the fuel system simultaneously. The truck went from 15 kilometers per hour to a dead stop in under a second. The hood buckled, and then the fire started. The blaze was visible even through the sandstorm, a bright, blooming flower of heat in her thermal scope. The radio was silent for a long moment. Then Wade's voice, barely audible through the static, said, Did she just kill a truck?" And somewhere in the chaos of that canyon, wounded and pinned and fighting to keep his men together, Lieutenant Jack Mercer said nothing. But Emily could hear his breathing on the open channel. He was alive, he was steady, and for the first time since she had walked into that briefing room, he was completely unable to say she was wrong. She moved her position again and found the 2 remaining heat signatures on the north wall. The storm was absolute now. Visibility was 0 without the thermal. She was shooting by heat alone, 2 shapes on a ridge, orange against gray, trying to understand what was killing them from the sky. She helped them understand. She sent the last 2 rounds. The canyon went quiet. It wasn't the quiet of safety. The wounded were still bleeding, Torres was still running out of time, and the extraction helicopters were still grounded. But the shooting had stopped. The north wall was still. The mortar was silent. The truck was a charred skeleton. Emily lay on the summit of Hill 350 as the sandstorm swallowed the world. Her rifle was hot in her hands, her shoulders were a roaring fire of pain, and her knuckles were still weeping blood. She didn't care. She listened to the team radio come back to life below her. 9 hostiles confirmed. 9 shots from a summit nobody thought she could reach. In a storm nobody thought a shot was possible through at distances that pushed the physical limits of her weapon. She had done it. From below, through the static and the howling wind, she heard Mercer's voice one more time. He wasn't talking to her. He was giving instructions to his team, getting them ready for whatever came next. But before he clicked off the channel in the space between one order and the next, he said something quiet. "Find her a way down." That was all he said. 4 words. But in that canyon, with the storm screaming and men bleeding into the desert floor, those words meant everything. 20 minutes ago, this man had called her a burden. He had essentially told 14 professionals that she was a mistake. And now he was using the same voice he used to keep men alive to make sure she got off that mountain. Wade heard it. He was already moving. "Rhea, stay on Torres. Keep pressure on that wound. Don't let up for anything." He grabbed Kellerman by the shoulder. "You're with me. We're going to the east base of 350 and we're going to talk her down." Kellerman, who was bleeding from a gash above his ear, looked at Wade as if he'd suggested they swim to the moon. "In this storm, Chief, we can barely see the man in front of us." "Then stay close," Wade snapped, and he disappeared into the swirling sand. Up on the summit, Emily heard none of the rescue efforts. All she heard was the wind. It was an absolute violent force now, turning the air into something physical. It wasn't just air you moved through. It was air that moved against you, that pushed and grabbed and had opinions about where you should be. The thermal on her rifle was still working, but the scope was beginning to collect grit despite the covers. She could feel the storm working on her gear, patient and relentless. She began to break down the rifle, not because she felt safe, but because she kept scanning between every step, a habit so deep it was instinct. She needed both hands for the descent, and the Barrett needed to be protected. Her hands were shaking now, a combination of fatigue, adrenaline, and the sudden realization that her body had been running on override for hours. She worked through the tremor. The rifle broke down clean, and she secured it in the case. She crawled to the edge of the summit and looked down. The route she had used to come up was no longer an option. The storm had changed the mountain. Every piece of loose rock was now a potential projectile, and the visibility was less than 8 feet. The shale fields below the second ridge were a death trap in these conditions. She sat back, the weight of the case pulling at her tired muscles, and waited for the radio to crackle again. She had done her job. Now she just had to survive the descent. The wind at this elevation was no longer just a weather pattern. It had become a physical presence, an invisible giant trying to shove Emily off the spine of the world. At 3,500 feet, the atmosphere didn't just move, it vibrated. It carried with it the jagged offerings of the mountain, lifting fragments of shale and flinging them through the air like shrapnel. In a desert sandstorm of this magnitude, a shale field became an active minefield, where every step was a gamble and every gust was a potential strike. The grit was everywhere, in her eyes, between her teeth, and coding the internal mechanisms of the heavy equipment she carried. She keyed the radio, her gloved fingers fumbling slightly against the cold plastic. The sound that returned was a wall of white noise, a jagged tearing sound that eventually resolved into a human voice. Wade's voice. It was broken by the interference of the storm, but the urgency remained intact. He was moving to the east base. He needed her status immediately. Emily braced her boots against a shelf of rock that felt like it might dissolve at any moment. The summit storm was at full force now, a blind, white-out screaming chaos that had compromised her planned ascent route. She told him as much, her voice sounding thin and distant even to her own ears. She was already scanning for an alternate way down, her mind a frantic overlay of the topographic maps she had memorized during the long, tense flight in. There was a pause in the feed, a heavy silence filled only by the roar of the wind on Wade's end. He was outside, already navigating the lower slopes. He suggested the east face, mentioning a gully system that the topo showed as a 60-degree slope. It was steep, dangerously so, but it offered the one thing she desperately needed, a shield. The east face was tucked away from the direct line of the wind vector. If she could reach it, she could survive. The problem was finding it in a world that had been reduced to shades of gray and stinging brown. She oriented herself not by sight, but by a cold, internal calculation. The sun was a myth somewhere behind the thick curtains of dust, but she knew the time. She knew the wind vector. She remembered the 1/24,000 scale map she had stared at for 90 minutes on the transport aircraft, a map she had studied with a frantic intensity because she had known, deep in her marrow, that a moment exactly like this was coming. She hadn't just been reading a map, she had been preparing for her own survival. "I can find it," she told Wade. The question of time was the next hurdle. How long to descend? She felt the 60-pound load on her back, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with every lungful of thin, dusty air. She thought about the state of her hands, the skin already raw and beginning to bleed where the grit had found its way under her gloves. She estimated 40 minutes, maybe less if she was willing to gamble with gravity. Wade's voice came back, stripped of all its usual bravado. It was the voice of a man counting seconds. The helicopter had a 30-minute window, not a minute more. The weather was closing in with a finality that would leave the landing zone completely inaccessible after that half-hour elapsed. If she wasn't at the East Base in 30 minutes, she was staying on the mountain. She didn't need him to finish the sentence. "I heard you," she said, and she started to move. The East Face was a revelation, but not a kind one. The wind didn't hit her head-on here. Instead, it came off the rock at a diagonal, a sideways force that acted like a lever. It wanted to peel her off the vertical surface and send her spinning into the void. It was a constant, nagging pressure that required a permanent lean into the mountain. She found the entrance to the gully system 7 minutes after leaving the summit. That left her 23 minutes to cover a distance she had originally pegged at 40. The math was a death sentence. She ran the numbers once, felt the cold weight of the reality, and then shoved them into a dark corner of her mind. Math was for the briefing room. Down here in the dirt and the wind, only movement mattered. She dropped into the gully and realized immediately that the topographic maps were liars. The slope wasn't 60 degrees. It was 75 in the upper sections. The rock was slick with deposited sand, making the descent less of a climb and more of a controlled fall. She used her boots as brakes, jamming them against the narrow walls of the gully, her hands acting as emergency stops against the larger formations. The rifle case was a nightmare of physics. It kept trying to get ahead of her, swinging forward over her shoulder every time she leaned back to arrest her momentum. It was a 60-pound pendulum determined to knock her teeth out. 3 times in the first 5 minutes, the case nearly took her face off before she learned to brace her left elbow against it, pinning it to her side in a move that cost her skin but bought her stability. At 12 minutes in, she hit the first real obstacle. A section of the gully had fractured recently, likely within the last few hours as the extreme temperature shifts of the storm worked on the ancient stone. The wall had collapsed into the floor, blocking the route with a pile of broken shale that was still settling. As she approached, she could hear it, the sound of dishes breaking in slow motion. It was the sound of a landscape that hadn't finished moving. The footing was an impossibility. If she tried to walk over it, she'd be ankle-deep in shifting rock, and the weight of the rifle case would pull her over backward. She looked to her right and saw a narrow ledge, perhaps 2 feet wide, running along the gully wall. It bypassed the collapse for about 15 meters before the gully cleared up again. She had to take it. There was no other way. But the ledge was covered in a fine-grained sand, a silken layer that acted like ball bearings. High winds, narrow ledges, and fine sand were a very specific cocktail of disaster, one she hadn't explicitly trained for, but one she understood with terrifying clarity on a theoretical level. She committed. She didn't let herself hesitate. 8 steps in, her right boot lost its purchase. The world tilted. The rifle case swung wild. She went down to one knee, her left hand slamming into the rock wall for balance, her right hand instinctively releasing the strap of the case to free her arm for a wider reach. For one genuine, heart-stopping second, she was kneeling on a 2-foot ledge in a screaming sandstorm with nothing below her but a 30-foot drop into a fractured shale field. The entire universe had narrowed down to a single contact point, her left hand pressed against the cold, unyielding rock. She felt her heart do something strange. It wasn't a beat. It was a full-body shudder, a primitive animal reaction to the proximity of the end. She didn't breathe. She just pressed herself into the wall, her fingers searching for even the slightest crack. She found her footing, forced her right foot to find a stable anchor, and stood up. She didn't look down. She kept moving. She cleared the traverse at the 14-minute mark. Back in the main gully, the terrain began to open up, the angle dropping back towards 60 degrees, then 50. The rock was more broken here, more forgiving, and she was able to increase her pace. It was a compromised kind of speed, the gait of someone carrying 60 pounds whose hands were bleeding and whose left arm was still shaking with the ghost of a chimney climb she had completed 90 minutes ago. 18 minutes. 19. 20. Wade's voice crackled through the headset again. He wanted a status. He sounded like a man who was already mourning her. Emily was breathing too hard to answer immediately. Each breath was a struggle against the dust that had turned the air into a thick, gritty soup. She managed to gasp out that she was still moving on the face. 8 minutes out, maybe 10. There was a pause, a silence that felt heavy with things left unsaid. Wade told her the pilot was asking for a final confirmation. He was burning fuel in a holding pattern, fighting the same wind she was. He needed a decision in 5 minutes. Go or stay. Emily looked down. She was still 400 meters of vertical descent above the base. The math had worsened while she wasn't looking. "Tell him I'm coming," she said. She didn't say it like a request. She said it like a fact of nature. She stopped managing the descent then. She stopped being careful. There is a version of moving down a mountain that is methodical and controlled, where you keep all the variables inside a safe margin of error. And then there is the version you use when the careful way gets you to the bottom too late. She chose the second version. She extended her margins until they vanished. She accepted a level of risk in every step that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. She moved faster than was technically correct, trusting that her reflexes would solve the problems as they arrived rather than trying to anticipate them. She was half running, half sliding, using the rifle case as a counterweight now instead of fighting it. She leaned into the mountain's angle and let momentum do the work that her depleted muscles could no longer manage. Rocks shifted and groaned under her feet, and she let them move, adjusting her weight mid-stride without stopping. The wind hit her like a physical blow, but she just bent lower and kept going. Her right boot plunged 6 inches into a gap in the shale, a potential ankle breaker, but she yanked it out and kept moving, losing less than a second of her precious time. At 24 minutes, she saw the base. It was a ghostly shape through the storm's haze, a dark smudge against the wall of driven sand. The wind had turned the atmosphere into something solid and opaque, but she could see the transition where the mountain finally surrendered to the desert floor. And she could see 2 shapes. They weren't rocks and they weren't terrain features. They were moving. Wade and Kellerman. They were still there, still waiting for her in the heart of the chaos. "I see you," she said into the radio. "I'm 60 meters above you, coming fast." Wade replied, but the radio cut to static before he could finish. It didn't matter. There was nothing left to say. There was only the movement, 27 minutes. The last 40 meters of the gully flattened into a debris fan, a broad apron of loose rock at the mountain's foot. She hit it at a pace that was objectively too fast for the footing and certainly too fast for the load she carried. It was the only pace that would reach the helicopter window. She felt the debris shift under every step, felt her ankles roll and recover in small, automatic corrections that happened far below the level of conscious thought. She was 10 meters from flat ground when the mountain finally decided to take a piece of her. A section of the gully wall behind her, the part she had been using for balance for the last 30 meters, gave way. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive collapse. It was a slow, grinding surrender of the rock's integrity. A section of wall, 12 meters long and 4 meters high, decided that the storm and the vibration of her passage were the final arguments it needed to hear. It came down in pieces at first, individual rocks breaking loose and sliding. Then the whole section moved as one. Emily heard it before she felt it. A grinding, accelerating roar that her brain instantly translated into a single word. Run. She was already at the edge of the debris fan. She had no more speed to find. In a final, desperate act, she threw herself forward in a full, uncontrolled lunge. She wanted to be anywhere but where she was. The leading edge of the collapse caught the tail of her ruck. It hit her in the back with the force of a semi-truck, throwing her face first into the desert floor. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the world out of focus. The rifle case slammed into her from above, driving her flat into the sand, and then there was a deluge of rock and debris on top of her. There was noise, then dust, then the strange, ringing silence of a body that has just survived a violent impact and is running a rapid internal diagnostic to see if it's still in one piece. Silence. The storm still screamed in the distance, but the local world of the gully had gone quiet. Emily moved her fingers. They worked. She moved her feet. They were still attached. She turned her head, feeling the grit of the desert floor against her cheek. She pushed up against the debris on her back, feeling the weight shift and slide. She got her hands under her and pushed with everything she had left. The weight came off. She rose to her knees, then to her feet. She was standing at the base of Hill 3150 in the middle of a sandstorm, covered in rock dust, but she was alive. 2 shapes materialized out of the haze. They were running. Wade hit her at a dead sprint, grabbing her by the shoulders with a grip that wasn't gentle. It was the grip of a man who had just watched a mountain try to swallow a person and was checking to see if the person he'd grabbed was still solid. He checked her eyes with the practiced, clinical assessment of someone with serious first aid training. "I'm good," she said. Her voice sounded strange, flat, distant, like it was coming from someone else. It was the voice of a person operating on the far side of an adrenaline wall. Wade didn't look convinced. "You don't look good," he said. "I'm functional," she countered. "That's the only thing that matters right now." Kellerman was already there, his hands moving over the rifle case, pulling away the larger pieces of debris. "Is the system?" "It's in a hard case," Emily said. "It's fine." She looked at Kellerman then, really looked at him. There was a gash above his ear that had dried into a dark, ugly streak down the side of his face. He was favoring his left side, moving with a stiff, guarded gait. "How's Torres?" she asked. Kellerman's face shifted for a fraction of a second, just enough to tell her everything. "Reyes has him," he said. He stopped. "We need to move." They moved. Wade set the pace, and it was brutal. It was faster than the terrain and the visibility should have allowed, and certainly faster than a wounded man's condition warranted. But the helicopter window was a cold, mathematical reality, and Torres's life was on the other side of it. Emily ran. She ran with the case and the ruck and the bleeding hands. She ran with a back that was already starting to protest the impact of the rock slide. She ran because Torres, with his quiet professionalism and his dark, steady eyes, deserved someone who didn't stop. They found the rest of the team at the mouth of the canyon's eastern exit. It was the route they had blown through when the north wall finally went quiet enough to allow movement. Mercer was on his feet, which was a miracle given the radio traffic. He was holding his left side with his right hand, the telltale posture of someone who had decided to deal with a significant injury later. His eyes found her immediately. Emily didn't know what to expect. She didn't expect warmth, and she certainly didn't expect an apology. She thought maybe she'd get a professional nod, the bare minimum of acknowledgement between operators. What she got was Mercer walking directly toward her through the swirling grit. He didn't hesitate. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't done since she first walked into the briefing room. "You're hit," he said. She looked down at herself. There was blood on her jacket, but it wasn't from her hands. It was on her left side, soaking through the fabric in a dark, spreading bloom. Now that he had pointed it out, she could feel it. A sharp, localized pain in her ribcage that she had been successfully ignoring for the last 10 minutes. "Rock from the collapse," she said. "I think it's a bruised rib. Maybe cracked." "That's not a bruised rib," Mercer said. He was looking at the blood pattern with the eyes of a man who had seen every variety of injury 11 deployments could offer. "Kellerman, get the corpseman." "Sir, I don't need Carter." His voice stopped her. It wasn't the command voice he had used earlier. There was something else underneath it, something that hadn't been there when the sun came up. "You're going to let someone look at that?" She looked at him for a long moment. His face was a mask of dust and exhaustion. His own hand was still pressed to his side, but his eyes were focused entirely on her. They weren't looking at the mission or the tactical map. They were looking at her as a person. "Copy that, sir," she said quietly. The corpseman, a young petty officer named Diaz, arrived a moment later. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in a single morning. He had been juggling 3 casualties simultaneously for the last 20 minutes, and his hands were stained with a history of the morning's violence. He opened his bag and worked on Emily while she stood as still as the mountain she'd just climbed. The wound was a laceration from a rock fragment, deep enough to bleed, but not the life-threatening emergency Mercer's expression had hinted at. Diaz packed it, taped it, and told her she'd need stitches the moment they hit the base. "You should also be evaluated for concussion," he added. "I'm fine," she said. "You said that already," Diaz replied, his voice not unkind but lacking any patience for bravado. "You're also standing in a sandstorm with blood on 3 different parts of your body. I want you to understand why I'm not entirely convinced." She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to it all day. Wade appeared beside her just as Diaz was finishing up. He didn't touch her, but he stood close, creating a small pocket of space in the wind. "The helicopter is 2 minutes out," he said. "They're coming in blind. GPS only. The pilot is either the bravest man alive or a complete lunatic." "Both," Kellerman muttered from somewhere behind them. "Torres?" Emily asked again. Wade's jaw worked, a small muscle twitching in his cheek. "Alive. Reyes kept him with us. It was close, Carter, very close." He paused, his eyes drifting back toward the silent canyon. "He's going to make it because the north wall stopped shooting." Emily nodded. She understood what he was telling her. She had been the silence on that north wall. The helicopter arrived like a ghost materializing out of a delirium. One moment there was only the screaming wind and the brown haze, and the next, a 20-ton machine was hovering 20 feet above the desert floor. The rotor wash collided with the storm, turning the air into a violent, churning vortex that made standing upright a genuine feat of strength. It touched down just long enough to be useful. The team moved with the fluid, wordless efficiency of people who had loaded casualties under fire more times than they could count. It was emotion stored in the muscles, bypasses the brain entirely. Torres went in first, Reyes never letting go of the pressure on the wound. Then the other casualties, followed by the walking wounded. Mercer stood by the open door, counting them in. It was the ancient, non-negotiable ritual of a commander, making sure the number of souls going in matched the number that had started the day. When Emily reached the door, Mercer was still there. He looked at her and she looked back, and then he did something she would spend many long nights thinking about. He didn't offer a formal, transactional handshake. He didn't offer a salute. He simply put his hand out. He put his hand out the way you help someone through a door. It was a gesture of profound simplicity, an unambiguous communication that said, "Asterisk, you belong here." Asterisk, she took his hand. He helped her into the vibrating, noisy heart of the aircraft. As the helicopter lifted, the desert floor vanished into the gloom. The team arranged themselves in the cramped space, the healthy men positioning their bodies to protect the casualties from the buffeting of the flight. Emily sat with her back against the vibrating hull, her rifle case across her knees. Her hands were still bleeding slightly through Diaz's dressings, resting flat on the case she had carried across a mountain. She felt the adrenaline beginning its long, slow retreat. It was like a tide going out, leaving behind all the jagged things it had covered during the height of the battle. The pain in her side began to introduce itself in earnest. Her shoulders began to ache with a deep structural fatigue. Her left arm, which had been trembling since the chimney climb, simply gave up and went numb. She didn't mind. She didn't need it to work anymore. She just needed to breathe. She looked across the hold at the men. There were 12 of them now. 2 were going home in a way that nobody in the helicopter was ready to talk about yet. 24 hours ago, she hadn't known a single one of them. She had walked into their world and been handed a verdict before she'd even spoken. She had been called a child, a burden, a doll, and a mistake. She caught Wade's eye. He was watching Torres, his big hands resting loosely in his lap. He felt her gaze and turned his head. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just held up 2 fingers, not a peace sign, 2 fingers. Asterisk, I know, asterisk, 2 of them, meaning the 2 men on the north wall who would never hurt anyone again. Meaning the reason Torres was still breathing was because a girl they didn't want had climbed a mountain they couldn't see. She nodded once. He nodded back, a silent contract signed in the back of a shaking helicopter. Kellerman, to his credit, just looked at his boots. He looked like a man who was carrying something too heavy to put into words. And then there was Mercer. He sat at the front of the aircraft, his hands still pressed to his side, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. It was the look commanders got when they were replaying the mission in their heads, looking for the gaps, the mistakes, the things they should have seen. Emily watched him. She watched him reach the moment in the mental replay where she had raised her hand in the briefing room. She watched him arrive at the moment he had called her luggage. He didn't look at her. Not yet. That would come later during the debriefs and the official reports. But she could see him living in that moment, and she understood him. She understood that Lieutenant Jack Mercer, a man with a silver star and 11 deployments, was currently grappling with the unforgiving realization that his certainty had almost cost him his entire team. He had dismissed the one person who could see the trap. He had called the woman who saved his people too small to matter. He was going to have to find a way to live with that. The helicopter flew north, deeper into the storm. Emily closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. Her system was still too wired, the morning still playing on a loop in the back of her mind, but she rested. She floated in that suspended state between the effort and the accounting, where the body is still but the mind hasn't yet come down from the altitude. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about a cold field outside of Laramie and the smell of cheap motor oil. She remembered a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated, and who had handed her the one weapon he knew could never be taken from her. Asterisk patience, asterisk he had told her, asterisk is the most dangerous weapon ever invented. Asterisk she had been patient for 7 years. She had been patient through every closed door, every condescending remark, and every folder slammed shut in her face. She had worked in the shadows, prepared in the silence, and waited for the one moment that would require everything she was. And when that moment had arrived on a crumbling mountain in a desert storm, she hadn't been too small. She hadn't been too light. She hadn't been a piece of political paperwork. She had been exactly what they needed. The storm outside was absolute, a world of zero visibility and violent winds that made the heavy aircraft shudder. But inside, 12 men were alive. Torres was breathing. And on the summit of Hill 3150, the 9 men who had set a perfect trap would never set another one. Emily opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were covered in dirt, blood, and the raw evidence of the work she had done. They were the hands of an operator. Outside, invisible in the dust, the mountain remained, patient and certain, waiting for the next person who needed to understand the truth of their own limits. The base hospital was a stark contrast to the mountain. It smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, a place of institutional quiet where the loud, violent things of the world were brought to be mended. Emily had been on the cot for 40 minutes by the time the doctor finished the stitches. There were 11 of them. The doctor, a Navy commander named Aucaffer, had counted them out loud as he worked, like he was marking time. Each tug of the needle was a sharp, precise sensation that Emily felt but did not react to. Pain was something that happened to other people now. She had left her relationship with it somewhere on the 75-degree slope of the east face. "You need to sleep," Aucaffer said. He was a compact man who wore his reading glasses at the very tip of his nose, never actually using them to read, but never taking them off either. Concussion protocol means someone is going to be waking you up every 2 hours. "You aren't leaving this building tonight." "Understood," she said. He looked at her over the rims of those glasses. "You also have 2 cracked ribs, not 1. The rock fragment that hit you nicked the bone on the lower one. It's going to hurt tomorrow. It's going to hurt a lot more than it does right now." "I'm looking forward to it," she replied. Aucaffer paused, his hand on his medical tray. "How's the arm?" She lifted her left arm and flexed her hand. The tremor was mostly gone, reduced to a faint, buzzing memory in the muscles. "Better. Nerve fatigue, I think. It'll pass," he said. "But you were at your absolute physical limit up there, Carter. Your body is going to send you a bill for what you did today. You should be ready to pay it." He left her then, sliding the curtain shut and leaving her in the dim, humming light of the ward. Emily lay back against the thin pillow and stared at the ceiling. The adrenaline was finally, truly gone. In its place was a heavy, leaden exhaustion that felt like it was pulling her through the mattress and into the earth itself. She could hear the muffled sounds of the hospital, the beep of monitors, the soft footfalls of the night staff, the distant murmur of voices. Somewhere in this building, Torres was being prepped for surgery, or perhaps he was already out of it. Somewhere, Mercer was sitting in a chair, refusing to lie down, giving his report to a colonel who wanted to know how a simple extraction had turned into a massacre. And somewhere else, Wade and Kellerman were likely sitting in a darkened room, drinking lukewarm coffee and trying to reconcile the morning with the rest of their lives. Emily closed her eyes. She didn't think about the medals that might come or the reports that would be written. She didn't think about the men she had killed or the life she had saved. She thought about the mountain. She thought about how the stone didn't care who you were or what people said about you. The mountain only cared if you could hold on. She had held on. And for the first time in 7 years, the silence in her head wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of a job well done. The bill Aucaffer had mentioned would come in the morning, along with the questions and the cameras and the politics. But for now, there was only the quiet, the smell of the antiseptic, and the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart that had refused to stop. She let the darkness take her, drifting into a sleep that was deep, dreamless, and earned. The silence of a military medical ward is never truly silent. It is a dense, layered thing, woven from the low-frequency hum of industrial generators, the distant, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors that never seems to fully leave the inner ear, and the muffled, shuffling footsteps of corpsemen moving between beds. Emily lay back on the thin, institutional mattress of the cot, her body finally beginning to register the full cost of the last 24 hours. She stared up at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of the utilitarian tiles, and listened to the bass settling around her. Outside, the wind was still working, a persistent, abrasive force that rattled the vents and reminded everyone that the desert was still there, waiting. The other casualties were in the main ward, separated from her by a thin partition that did little to block the sounds of low groans and the occasional sharp intake of breath. Torres was in surgery. Reyes had told her that much in the back of the helicopter, leaning across the vibrating floor to shout over the roar of the engines. He had made sure she heard it, his eyes locked onto hers with a desperate kind of intensity. "Torres is in surgery," he'd said. "They think he's going to make it." And then the words that had stayed with her, "Thanks to you." Emily had only nodded, her throat too tight for words, and looked down at the blood-stained floor of the bird. The alternative was showing Reyes something she wasn't ready to show anyone in this building. A glimpse of the raw, jagged relief that threatened to break through her practiced composure. She wasn't ready to be human yet. She was still looking at the ceiling, trying to breathe through the sharp stabs of pain in her side, when the door to the small recovery room creaked open. She expected it to be Aakaffer, coming back to check her vitals for the third time in an hour, or perhaps die as the corpseman with a fresh round of painkillers. She did not expect Mercer. When the commander stepped through the door, Emily had approximately 1 second to adjust her face before he saw it. 1 second was not nearly enough time to rebuild the walls she had spent 7 years perfecting. It meant he saw her unguarded for that fleeting moment, tired, hurting, and far more human than she'd allowed herself to be in front of any of these men since she'd first stepped off the transport aircraft into the dry heat of the base. He saw it. She knew he saw it because something in his expression shifted instantly. It was a small adjustment, a subtle recalibration, like a man recalculating the distance between himself and something he had dangerously misjudged. Mercer had changed out of his dust-caked field gear. He was in clean fatigues now, but she could see the slight, telltale bulk of a dressing under his shirt on his left side. He moved with a guarded stiffness, the way a man moves when a doctor has given him a list of physical restrictions, and he has decided to comply with exactly 60% of them. Without asking permission, he pulled the room's single metal chair to the side of her cot and sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The generators hummed their relentless song outside, and the storm was finally weakening. She could tell by the way the building had stopped its periodic, violent shuddering and settled into a more consistent, low-level vibration. 6 hours of a screaming sandstorm had passed, and now the desert was remembering how to be still. "Torres is out of surgery," Mercer said finally. His voice was low, gravelly from the dust and the shouting. Emily closed her eyes for a heartbeat, a single second of profound stillness. When she opened them, she had to clear her throat to find her voice. "He's going to make it. He's going to make it," Mercer confirmed. The surgeon said another 20 minutes and the answer would have been very different. He paused, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just above her head. Reyes kept him alive on the ground, but Reyes needed those 20 minutes to work with. He got them because the north wall stopped shooting. Emily didn't say anything. She didn't know how to respond to the weight of that statement, so she remained silent, watching the way the light from the hallway caught the gray in Mercer's hair. "I need to say something to you," Mercer said, his voice taking on a different quality, something more formal yet more personal. "And I need you to let me finish before you respond." She looked at him, her eyes steady despite the exhaustion. "Go ahead." He looked down at his hands for a moment. They were the hands of a man used to action, now forced into the stillness of a hospital room. He seemed to be assembling words in a specific order, a task that clearly didn't come naturally to someone who had spent his career in rooms where the words were already decided by protocol and rank. "I was wrong," he said. The words were blunt, delivered with the cadence of a man who didn't like the taste of them but refused to spit them out. "In the briefing on the route about you." He spoke in short, clipped sentences, letting each one land individually in the quiet room rather than letting them blur together into a general apology. "I made a tactical error on the road. I made a command error in how I ran that brief, and I made a..." He stopped, his jaw tightening. He started again. "I made a personal error in how I treated you from the moment you walked into that room." Emily remained quiet, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. She had been doing this for 7 years, and in all that time, she had never heard a commanding officer speak like this. "I've been doing this for 11 years, Mercer continued. "I have never had someone under my command who..." He stopped again. He was not a man who stopped often. Emily could tell that hesitation was not in his operational profile. It was a foreign language he was forced to speak. "You climbed a near-vertical mountain in the dark with 60 pounds on your back in a sandstorm that grounded our air support. You established a firing position at an elevation that was not on any operational plan. You engaged 9 hostile targets across distances that my best shooters would not have even attempted in those conditions. And you did it because you read the terrain correctly in my briefing room, and I told you to sit down." The room was so quiet that the hum of the light fixture seemed like a roar. "I almost got my team killed," Mercer said, his voice dropping an octave, "because I decided what you were before I looked at what you could do." He finally met her eyes, holding them with an unflinching intensity. "I'm not going to dress that up. That's what happened." Emily had been waiting 7 years for something in this neighborhood. Not this exact apology, and certainly not from this exact man, but something in the general territory of a person in authority looking at her directly and acknowledging the reality of her existence and her capability. She had imagined this moment occasionally, in the way one imagines winning the lottery, as a kind of idle thought experiment about what it would feel like. She had imagined it would feel like a victory, like a heavy weight being lifted. In reality, it felt quieter than that. It felt like being seen for the first time in a very long time, which brought its own complicated set of emotions. It wasn't just relief. It was the sudden, sharp ache of all the years she had spent being invisible. "I appreciate that, sir," she said, her voice small but clear. "Jack," he said. She blinked, confused for a second. "Sir, after this morning," he made a small gesture with his hand, a movement that seemed to encompass the mountain, the canyon, the 11 stitches in her side, and everything else they had survived. "Jack is fine." She looked at him for a moment, seeing the man behind the rank. "Emily," she said softly. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't a smile. Mercer's face seemed constitutionally unbuilt for full smiles. But it was a shift in that direction, a loosening of the tension around his eyes. "The debrief is at 1800, he said, returning to his professional tone. "I need you there." "I'll be there," she promised. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He moved toward the door but stopped with his hand on the frame, turning back to look at her one last time. The next thing he said was the thing she had not expected, the thing that landed differently from everything else. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an acknowledgement of rank, and it wasn't a tactical assessment. It was just a truth, spoken in the simple, undefended way things are said when someone has decided to stop managing the distance between themselves and the reality of a situation. "In 11 years, Mercer said, I have never seen anyone do what you did today." He paused, his expression unreadable. "I don't think I'll see it again." Then he was gone, leaving the door to swing shut behind him. Emily lay back on the cot and looked at the ceiling once more. She felt every inch of her body. The 11 stitches in her side, the 2 cracked ribs that flared with every breath, the deep nerve fatigue in her left arm, and the torn, raw knuckles on both hands. She took a slow, painful breath and thought, okay, just that. Okay. The debrief at 1800 took place in the main operations room, the same room where the initial briefing had happened that morning. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. The same corkboard was there and the same topographic map, but the map was different now. It was covered in markers that hadn't been there before. 9 red markers dotted the north wall ridge line, marking the positions of the hostiles. And there was one more, a single blue marker on the summit of Hill 350. It wasn't a hostile marker. It was a blue pin that someone had placed there on purpose to represent her. Every man who had been in the canyon was in the room. The ones who could stand were standing, including Kellerman, who had 14 stitches running like a jagged mountain range above his ear. He looked pale, but his jaw was set, and he refused to sit. 2 men were absent, the 2 who were going home in flag-draped coffins. Their absence was a physical weight in the room, a cold pocket of air that everyone felt and nobody mentioned, because there were no words adequate for it. At the far end of the table sat Baxter, the CIA liaison. She had been a ghost during the morning's events, but now she was watching Emily with an expression that was doing careful work to remain neutral. She had a recording device and a laptop open, radiating the watchful quality of someone whose job was to observe, report, and categorize rather than to feel. Mercer ran the debrief the way he ran everything, structured, methodical, and devoid of theater. He walked through the timeline, the actions at each phase, the outcomes, the casualties, and the lessons learned. He didn't editorialize. He didn't assign blame out loud. He simply presented the operational sequence as a factual record and let the facts speak for themselves. When he reached the phase of the debrief covering Emily's actions, he didn't look up from his notes. The room, which had erupted in laughter at her expense only hours ago, was now absolutely, hauntingly still. Specialist Carter, having assessed the approach route and identified a high probability of hostile elevated positioning on the north wall, made an independent decision to ascend Hill 350 and establish an overwatch position, Mercer read. He looked up then, his eyes sweeping the room. That decision was made without authorization and in direct contravention of my standing order, placing her behind the main element. He paused, letting the weight of the insubordination hang in the air for a second before continuing. It was also the decision that preserved the mission and kept this team alive. The record will reflect both of those facts. Wade, who had been leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed over his massive chest, said nothing. But he nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement that meant something very specific in the language of soldiers. Kellerman made a sound, not a word, but a low grunt somewhere between acknowledgement and something more complicated. Baxter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing the moment for the official record. Mercer continued the debrief. Confirmed kills, ammunition expenditure, equipment status, casualty accounting. When he reached the end, he set his notes down and looked at the room. Questions, comments, anything that needs to be on the record. Silence followed. Then Reyes, the corpseman, raised his hand. He didn't raise it like a soldier asking for permission. He raised it like a man who had something to say and had decided it needed to be heard. "I want it on the record," Reyes said, his voice steady. "Torres is alive, and the reason he's alive is that the North Wall went quiet when it did. And the reason the North Wall went quiet is Carter." He lowered his hand, his gaze meeting Emily's for a brief, intense second. "I just want that to be in the record." "It's in the record," Mercer said firmly. "Thank you, Reyes." Then something happened that Emily had not expected and could not have prepared for. Wade pushed off the wall and walked over to the corkboard. He looked at the topographic map, at the 9 red markers and the single blue one on the summit. He turned to face the room, his voice quieter than his normal booming tone, which somehow made it more powerful. "I owe her an apology," Wade said. Nobody moved. The air in the room seemed to thicken. "At the vehicle line this morning," Wade continued, "she came to me. She told me the canyon was wrong. I knew she was right, and I told her that whatever she decided, she'd better just be right about it. And then I walked away." He looked at Emily directly, his expression open and honest in a way that was rare for a man of his stature. "I should have taken it to the lieutenant myself. I should have backed her in that briefing. I had enough rank to make it a conversation instead of a dismissal, and I didn't use it." He paused, the weight of the admission visible on his face. "That's on me, and I'm sorry." The room was the kind of silence that only happens when a profound truth is spoken in a space that isn't used to it. Emily looked at Wade, this enormous, decorated, confident man who had built a career out of being right. Right now he was standing in front of his entire team, stripping away his pride and telling them exactly where he had failed. She could see what it cost him to do it. She understood that cost because she had spent 7 years paying the opposite version of it. The cost of being dismissed, of being the one who wasn't listened to. But she also understood, looking at Wade, that the cost of admitting you were wrong is its own particular burden. He was carrying it without flinching. "I know," she said softly. "Thank you." Wade nodded once, a sharp, respectful movement, and went back to his place against the wall. The debrief moved on to its conclusion, the tension in the room easing but the atmosphere remaining solemn. When the room began to clear, the men filed out in ones and twos, the quiet, post-operation drift of people who desperately needed food and sleep. There was a particular kind of solitude that followed a day that had required too much of everyone. Baxter, the CIA liaison, stopped beside Emily on her way to the door. "Specialist Carter," she said. Her voice was the careful, professional instrument of someone who measured every syllable before letting it leave her mouth. "I'm going to need a full statement from you for the operational record. Tomorrow, when the medical situation permits." "Of course," Emily said. Baxter looked at her for a moment, her neutral expression softening just a fraction. "Off the record?" she asked. She glanced at the door to ensure they were alone, then looked back. "What you did today is going to be in a file that very few people will ever read. The kind of file that gets high classification levels and sits in a building in Virginia." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I want you to know that the people who do read it are going to understand exactly what it means, even if nobody else ever does." Emily held her gaze, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "That's enough," she said. Baxter nodded and was gone. The room was empty now, except for Emily and the corkboard. She stood in front of it for a long time, looking at those 9 red markers and the 1 blue one. She thought about her grandfather, his hands rough and calloused from a lifetime of work, telling her that she would have to be twice as good to be taken half as seriously. He had told her that the only answer to that unfair math was to be so good that the math stopped mattering. She had done the math today. She reached out and touched the blue marker on the summit of the hill, then turned off the light and walked back toward the hospital. The mess hall at 2100 was mostly empty. The main dinner service had long since wound down, leaving behind the institutional remainder of military food at the end of a long day. Coffee that had been burning on the burner for hours, and whatever scraps hadn't been eaten. The atmosphere was one of quiet exhaustion, the smell of industrial cleaner beginning to overtake the scent of gravy. Emily took a tray and sat alone at the very end of a long table near the wall. This was where she always sat. It was the place she had occupied for 7 years in mess halls, briefing rooms, and operation centers. The end of the table, the spot that required the least negotiation of other people's willingness to include her. It was the safe harbor of the invisible. She was halfway through her meal when the door opened. Wade came in first, followed by Kellerman, who was moving carefully to keep his stitches from pulling. Then came Reyes, still in his field clothes, smelling of the sharp antiseptic from the hospital where he had spent the last 3 hours. Then 4 others followed, 2 of the Rangers and 2 of the SEALs she hadn't spoken to directly. Mercer came in last because commanders always come last. They entered the room and looked at her. Emily looked back, her fork suspended in midair. Nobody said anything. There were 12 other tables in the mess hall, most of them completely empty and available. There was no tactical reason, no logistical necessity, and no practical imperative that required any of these men to do what they did next. Wade walked straight to her table. He pulled out the chair directly across from her and sat down. Kellerman took the seat beside him. Reyes sat down right next to Emily. The others filled in around them, packing in together, not at a polite distance, but shoulder to shoulder, the way people sit when they've decided they belong together. The table that had been a solitary island of one suddenly became a crowded continent of 12. There were no speeches. There was no dramatic announcement or formal ritual of apology. It was just men sitting down because they had decided where they belonged, and they had decided it was here with her. The decision itself was the entire statement. Emily looked down at her tray, her eyes stinging. She picked up her fork and kept eating. Wade poured himself a cup of the burnt coffee. Kellerman reached into the bread basket in the center of the table and took a roll with the casual ownership of a man who had decided this was his table now. Reyes, sitting beside her, started talking quietly to the ranger on his other side about something mundane, an equipment manifest or the weight limits of the helicopters. The conversation was so normal, so grounded in the everyday reality of their lives, that Emily felt a sudden, sharp pressure in her chest. It wasn't tears. She wasn't going to cry in the mess hall, but it was the release of something that had been held back for a long, long time. The weight of the wall-adjacent seat, the 7 years of being furniture in a room rather than a person, finally shifted. It didn't vanish, but it moved, the way a massive stone moves when the leverage finally changes. Mercer was across the table and 3 seats down. He caught her eye once, a brief, silent acknowledgement before looking back to his coffee. She looked away too, focusing on her food, but the air around her felt different. The table was full of people who had voted with their feet on who she was. She thought about the morning, the cold transport aircraft, the tarmac with no one waiting, the folder being slammed shut in her face, and the sound of the laughter. Then she thought about the mountain in the dark, the narrow chimney she had climbed, the screaming wind, the 9 heat signatures flickering in her thermal scope, and the 4-second flight of a bullet that had changed everything. She thought about Torres, alive in a hospital bed because 20 minutes had been enough. She remembered her grandfather's hands, certain and steady, placing a rifle in hers in a field that smelled of Texas summer and motor oil. He had told her that patience was the most dangerous weapon ever invented. She had been patient, and now she was sitting at a full table, eating food that tasted exactly like it always did, in a room that looked exactly as it always had, yet everything was entirely different. Kellerman said something to Wade that was apparently funny, because Wade made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he ever got. Reyes was still talking logistics. Someone at the far end of the table was arguing good-naturedly about something that had nothing to do with canyons or mountains, using the easy, irreverent tone of people who have survived something together. They were already beginning the process of turning the day into a story they could live inside of. Emily ate her food. She was not invisible. She was not luggage or a mistake on a piece of paper. She was at the table. Outside, in the dark desert night, the sandstorm had finally died. The sky above the base was clearing, star by star, the way the desert sky always does, gradually then all at once, until the whole expanse was open and vast and full of more light than the human eye could hold. And in the distance, the mountain stood where it had always stood, patient and still, exactly tall enough. She slept for 11 hours. It wasn't the light, interrupted sleep of someone whose mind is still racing, but the deep, total unconsciousness of a person whose system has finally accepted that the emergency is over. Her body shut down every non-essential function to begin the long, grueling work of repair. Akaffer had checked on her at midnight and again at 0200, shining a penlight in her eyes to check for concussion symptoms. Both times she had come partially awake, answered his questions correctly, and drifted back into the blackness before he even reached the door. She woke at 0712 to the sound of the base coming alive. The generators were cycling, vehicles were moving, and the muffled percussion of a military installation filled the air. A base like this doesn't pause for anything, not even the aftermath of a near disaster. Emily lay still for a moment, conducting a mental inventory of her injuries. Her ribs announced themselves immediately and with considerable authority. Her hands were stiff inside their dressings, and her left arm felt faintly unreliable, like a tool used past its rated capacity. The stitches in her side pulled painfully when she took a deep breath. She sat up anyway. On the chair beside her cot, the same chair Mercer had sat in the night before, someone had left a cup of coffee. It was a paper cup with a lid still warm. Someone had brought it recently enough that the heat still radiated through the cardboard. There was no note, no name. She picked it up, took a sip, and decided that some things didn't need to be explained to be understood. Akaffer cleared her for limited mobility at 0800. He gave her a list of restrictions that she memorized and intended to comply with to approximately the same degree she always did, honoring the spirit of them when they agreed with her judgment. He told her Torahs had been moved out of the ICU overnight. He was stable, talking, and apparently asking for real food, which Akaffer considered the most reliable indicator of a man's will to live. He asked about you, Akaffer added almost as an afterthought. What did he say? Emily asked. Akaffer paused, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell the little sniper she can name her first kid whatever she wants, and I'll think it's a great name." He looked at Emily over his glasses. I don't fully understand the sentiment, but the intent seemed positive. Emily looked at her coffee cup, a genuine smile finally breaking through. Tell him I'll take him up on that, she said. She dressed carefully, favoring her left side, and made her way to the operations building. It was 0830, and the building was humming with the specific administrative energy that follows a combat operation. This was the paperwork architecture of war, the formal reporting that turns chaotic events into permanent records. She had expected to find a clerk or a duty officer. Instead, she found Mercer alone at the main table. He had 3 folders open in front of him and a pen in his hand. He looked up when she entered, his movements more fluid than the night before. You should be in bed, he said, though there was no real bite in the command. Akaffer cleared me for limited mobility, she countered. Limited mobility doesn't mean the operations building at 0830. I'm not doing operations, she said, pulling out a chair across from him. I'm doing paperwork, the after-action report. Mercer looked at her steadily for a moment, then slid one of the folders across the table. I was going to have someone bring it to you. Emily opened the folder. The after-action report was 12 pages long, a formal military accounting of the mission from launch to extraction. It was written in the specific, dry language of the Army and Navy, a story told for people who weren't there to evaluate and file. She read the first 3 pages methodically, looking for what was actually there rather than what she expected. The report was startlingly accurate. Mercer had written it with a brutal honesty that surprised her, because accuracy required him to include details that reflected poorly on his own command decisions. She hadn't been sure if the Mercer who apologized by her cot was the same man who would put those failures into the permanent record. He was. The report described the approach, the route selection, the flawed intel assessment, and the specific decision to disregard Carter's tactical input. It laid out the consequences in precise, unsparing language. She turned to page 7 and stopped. The section covering her actions was headed in formal military style. Beneath it, in measured prose that had clearly been rewritten until it was exactly right, was the account of everything she had done from the moment she turned east at the canyon entrance. The climb, the firing positions, the 9 targets, the truck, the descent, the collapse. It was all there, rendered in the flat, factual language of military reporting. Yet in that very flatness, the scale of what she had achieved seemed to grow. There was no need for hyperbole when the facts were this loud. She looked up from the page, the weight of the document in her hands. It was more than a report. It was a testament. For 7 years, she had been fighting a ghost, trying to prove she was more than a name on a roster or a gender in a briefing room. She had been searching for the moment when the truth of her capability would finally be recorded in a way that couldn't be erased or laughed away. This was that moment. The paper was heavy, the ink was dry, and the record was set. She looked at Mercer, who was watching her with a quiet, expectant look. "Is it accurate?" he asked. She looked back down at the page, at the description of a woman who had climbed a mountain in a storm and saved a team that hadn't wanted her there. "Yes," she said softly. "It's accurate." Mercer nodded once and went back to his work. Emily sat there for a long time, the report open in front of her, listening to the sounds of the base and feeling the warmth of the coffee still in her system. She was no longer just a shadow at the end of the table. She was part of the story now, a permanent fixture in the history of this unit. And for the first time in 7 years, as she sat in the quiet of the operations room, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. There is a specific, sterile quality to official military language that refuses to dramatize. It does not use flowery adjectives or lean on the crutch of emotional appeal. It simply states facts as if they were carved into stone. Sometimes, that plain statement of a thing is more powerful, more devastating, than any poetic description could ever hope to be. Emily Carter sat in the quiet of the office, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and the faint, metallic tang of the base's ventilation system, and felt the world tilt as she reached the final paragraph of the after-action report. It was the section where Mercer had written the tactical outcome of the operation. He had detailed the survival of all personnel present at the time of the hostile engagement, the successful neutralization of a prepared ambush site, and the preservation of the mission's operational viability. These were the metrics of success, the cold data points of a win. But it was the next sentence that stopped her breathing entirely. The report stated, with a clinical precision that felt like a heartbeat, that the entirety of the success was attributable to the independent action of specialist Emily Carter. Mercer had written that her assessment of the threat environment was correct, and that her decision to establish Overwatch on Hill 350, while contrary to standing orders, demonstrated a level of tactical judgment, physical capability, and precision marksmanship that was without precedent in his operational experience. The words seemed to vibrate on the page. The standing order she had contravened was his. The judgment that had superseded it was hers. The record, Mercer had concluded, should reflect this without ambiguity. Emily read the lines twice, her eyes tracing the ink as if trying to find a hidden trap, a caveat that would take it all back. She finally looked up at Mercer. He was watching her from across the desk with the careful, unblinking attention of someone who has placed something of immense value in front of another person, and is waiting with held breath to see how they receive it. The silence in the room was not the heavy, suffocating silence of their first meeting. It was something thinner, more fragile. Emily found her voice, though it felt small in the quiet. She told him that he didn't have to write it that way. She knew how a report like this would reflect on his command judgment. It was a public admission that a subordinate had seen the truth when he had been blind to it. Mercer didn't flinch. He acknowledged that he knew the cost, but his gaze remained steady. He told her there were ways to write a report that were accurate and still protected the commander, ways to massage the truth into a strategic shape that satisfied the brass without burning bridges. He had spent 11 years writing reports that were both accurate and strategically sound. He knew the dance perfectly. He knew how to hide a failure in the shadows of a victory. But then he paused, the weight of his years of service settling into the lines around his eyes, and told her that he had chosen not to. There was a difference, he said, between what was accurate and what was honest. He admitted he had spent enough time on the wrong side of that line. This report, he insisted, was going to be honest. Emily looked back down at the page. Her mind drifted back through the last 7 years. A long, exhausting corridor of closed doors, folders slammed shut, and verdicts rendered by people who had never seen her fire a rifle. She thought about the paperwork that had preceded her arrival at this base, the political paperwork Mercer had mentioned in the initial briefing. as if she were a mere document to be filed away rather than a soldier with a pulse and a purpose. And now, here was a different kind of paperwork. This was the kind that spoke her name and validated what she had done. It spoke in the very language of the institution that had spent nearly a decade deciding she didn't belong. And it said that she was not only enough, but that she was the reason 14 men were still breathing. She whispered a thank you, knowing the words were inadequate for the weight of what he had given her. But she said them anyway because they were the only truth she had left. Mercer simply picked up his pen, the moment of vulnerability passing as he shifted back into the role of commander. He informed her that Baxter, the agency representative, wanted her formal statement at 10 o'clock. Baxter had asked the day before, but Emily had been in the hospital. Mercer corrected himself with the sharp precision of a man who was now being exact about every detail of her situation. She hadn't been in surgery, he noted, but in the ward. He told her he would be in the building if she needed anything, then returned his focus to the mountain of folders on his desk. Emily went back to page 1 of the report and started reading again. This time, she absorbed the whole picture, building the mental map she would need for the interview. The room grew quiet again, the only sounds being the scratch of pens on paper and the distant, muffled roar of the bass waking up outside. It was the ordinary work of a morning, but it was being done by two people who had spent the previous day at war with each other's assumptions and had finally found a common frequency. Baxter arrived at exactly 0958. Emily noted the time because it revealed the architecture of the woman's mind, someone who considers being on time a form of being late. She arrived with her recorder, her laptop, and the same mask of careful neutrality she had worn since the beginning. She sat up at the far end of the long table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had conducted 1,000 interviews in 1,000 bleak, austere locations across the globe. The statement took 90 minutes. Baxter was a master of her craft, asking questions in a methodical, non-leading way that opened up wide spaces for Emily to fill. She didn't suggest the shape of the answer. She simply waited for the truth to pour in. Emily filled those spaces with the same precision she used on the mountain. She reported what she saw, what she assessed, what she decided, and what the results were. She did not editorialize. She did not beg for credit or advocate for her career. She simply stated the record as if she were a witness to someone else's life. When the recorder was finally clicked off, Baxter sat back, her expression shifting ever so slightly. The neutrality didn't vanish, but it adjusted, like a lens clicking into focus. She told Emily that the operational record they had just created was going to be reviewed at a level that would affect her career in ways she might not anticipate. Emily waited, her hands resting still on the table. Baxter explained that there had already been a conversation happening at a level far above this base, a discussion about the tactical decision-making of the previous day, and about Emily specifically. When Emily asked what kind of conversation it was, Baxter chose her words with extreme care. It was the kind of conversation, she said, that results in opportunities if Emily wanted them. She let that heavy implication hang in the air for a moment. Emily looked at her steadily and told her that she hadn't done what she did for a conversation or a promotion. She had done it because 14 men were about to die in a canyon. Baxter closed her laptop with a soft thud and told her that was exactly why the conversation was happening. After Baxter left, Emily sat alone for a while. The morning was stretching into afternoon, and the base was humming with the energy of ongoing operations. The after-action report remained open in front of her, the ink dry, the words permanent. For the first time since she had stepped off the helicopter, she felt the full weight of the previous day settling into her bones. Now that the formal machinery of reporting and documenting had finished its work, the reality of it was allowed to land. 14 men were alive. Torres was alive. 2 men were not. There were 9 targets on a north wall who would never set another ambush. There was a truck on a ridgeline, a 4-second bullet through a blinding sandstorm, and her own hands, still healing in her lap. They were still her hands. She closed the folder and stood up, her body aching with the memory of the climb, and went to find Torres. The hospital ward smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Torres was in the 4th bed, propped up at an awkward angle that the nurses had clearly forced upon him. His face bore the expression of a man who was having a long-running argument with his own physical limitations. He was a forest of tubes and wires, hooked to monitors and a Roman 4 drip that beeped with rhythmic indifference. He looked human in a way she hadn't seen before, The armor was gone, replaced by the pale vulnerability of the post-operative ward. When he saw her standing in the doorway, his face did something immediate and unguarded. He didn't have the strength to mask his reaction. He called her name and she walked over to the chair beside his bed and sat down. She asked him how he felt, and he gave her the only honest answer a man in his position could, like he'd been shot. He looked her over, noting the way she moved with the careful stiffness of someone protecting cracked ribs, the bandages visible above her collar, and the state of her hands. He told her she looked worse than he did. She pointed out that he was the one attached to 4 machines, but he countered that at least he was lying down. He asked her why she wasn't doing the same. Emily told him she had things to do, and Torres looked at her with those dark, direct eyes she had noticed on the vehicle line that first morning. They were the eyes of a man who didn't waste his attention. He told her that Akaffer had mentioned she was still on the mountain when the helicopter window was called. He knew she had come down the east face in the middle of a storm, and that the mountain had literally collapsed beneath her. When she confirmed she had made it down in 29 minutes, Torres went quiet. The ward was peaceful, the only sound being the steady beep of the monitors and the soft breathing of a sleeping patient a few beds down. Torres broke the silence with a voice that lacked any performance or bravado. He admitted that he had been one of the people laughing in the briefing room the morning before. Emily told him she knew, but he pressed on. He wanted to apologize. She tried to tell him he didn't have to, but he cut her off with a slight edge to his voice. Not anger, but a firm, functional resolve. He told her he wanted to, and that there was a difference between having to do something and choosing to do it. He explained that he had laughed because everyone else was laughing, and he hadn't stopped to think about what he was mocking. And then he had spent 20 minutes on a canyon floor, with his life leaking out of him while Reyes tried to hold him together. The only reason he had those 20 minutes, he said, was her. He asked her to let him apologize and thank her without telling him it wasn't necessary. Emily looked at him. The Roman 4, the monitors, the man who had shown her a small, easy courtesy at the vehicle line by giving her a moment of privacy. She accepted his apology and told him he was welcome. The tension in Torres's face evaporated into a look of profound relief. He mentioned that Mercer had already been by that morning to read him the paragraph from the after-action report. He was surprised that the commander had come personally to do that. It seemed that the previous day had been educational for a lot of people, Mercer included. Emily thought about the arc of the last 24 hours, starting with a slammed folder and ending with a room full of men who had voted with their chairs to support her. "People can surprise you," she said. Torres smiled weakly and told her that she had certainly surprised 14 of them. She stayed with him for another 20 minutes, talking about the things soldiers talk about when the war is temporarily at bay. They discussed the abysmal quality of the hospital food and whether the coffee had always been this bad or if the storm had somehow ruined the beans. It was the easiest conversation she'd had in years. There was no undercurrent of judgment, no need to prove her worth, no exhaustion from fighting for a place at the table. She was just a person talking to another person, both of them grateful to be drawing breath. The simplicity of it was extraordinary. When she finally left the ward, she found Wade leaning against the corridor wall, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked exactly as he had that first morning, patient, unmoving, a man who knew how to wait for the things that mattered. He asked how Torres was doing, and Emily told him he was complaining about the food. Wade's face relaxed at that. It was a sign of life. They stood together in the comfortable silence of two people who had shared a crisis and no longer needed to perform for one another. Wade told her that Mercer had shown him the after-action report as well. He joked that for a man like Mercer, writing those words was the verbal equivalent of a sonnet. He had asked Wade if he'd missed anything, and Wade had told him the report was perfect. Emily felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. Wade straightened up, his tone shifting to something more serious. He revealed that he had made some calls that morning to contacts at Special Operations Command. He wanted her to know that he had put her name in front of the people who could make things happen for her career. Emily looked at him, her defensive instincts flickering for a second. She told him she hadn't asked him to manage her career. Wade didn't apologize. He knew she didn't need him to manage it, but he argued that he wasn't managing. He was just ensuring the right people knew the right name. What they did with that information, and what Emily did with any offers, was up to them. He pointed out that 7 years was a long time to be in rooms where no one was saying her name to the right people. He had the power to change that, so he did. He told her she could be mad if she wanted, but he wasn't going to take it back. Emily looked at him for a long time. This was the man who had initially walked away from her, but now he was standing his ground, refusing to walk away from his responsibility to her. She told him she wasn't mad. Wade nodded, satisfied, and invited her to the common room where Kellerman was allegedly cheating at cards. The common room was a pragmatically furnished space, the kind of room an institution provides when it knows soldiers need a place to exist between the work and the sleep. Kellerman was at the center table, a cluster of stitches in his head that he was clearly ignoring in favor of the game. Reyes was there along with several rangers. When Emily walked through the door, Kellerman did something she never would have expected from him. He stood up. He didn't make a speech or a grand gesture, he just stood. Then Reyes stood. Then one by one, every man at the table stood in total silence. Emily stopped in the doorway, frozen. She had been trained to survive the worst conditions the earth could throw at her: gunfire, ice, isolation, and pain. But she had never been trained for this. She had no idea what to do with the feeling of a room full of men standing in silent tribute to her presence. She looked at Wade, who just shrugged. He had known this was coming and had purposely let her walk into it unprepared because the reality of it was better than any warning. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of the military. No wrapping, no ceremony, just the thing itself. Emily walked to the table and sat down. They all followed suit, and the game continued as if nothing had happened, the cards being dealt in the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. 2 hours later, when the game broke up and the men headed for dinner, Emily finally found herself truly alone. She walked outside, seeking the desert air. The late afternoon desert was a mirror of the landscape she had known as a child in West Texas. It was the world she had seen through truck windows and across dusty fields where her grandfather had taught her the art of patience. He was a man who understood that the world wouldn't change for you, but that you could learn to move through it in ways the world didn't expect. She stood outside the hospital and looked south toward the mountains. There, unmistakable against the darkening sky, was Hill 350. She could see the jagged scar of the gully where the rock had given way. She could see the peak where she had lain in the sand and changed the course of 14 lives with 9 shots. The mountain looked indifferent, as it always did. It didn't care what had happened on its slopes. The meaning wasn't in the rock, it was in the people. She heard a familiar footstep behind her. Mercer came to stand beside her, looking at the same distant peak. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of a judge and a defendant, but of 2 colleagues at the end of a very long day. He told her the official report would go up the chain the next morning, including the paragraph about her, exactly as written. He also mentioned that he had started the process for a formal commendation. Emily started to protest, but Mercer used the same phrase everyone else had: "I know." He explained that the commendation wasn't for her ego, it was for the record. He wanted to ensure that the next time she walked into a room, the people inside would have already seen what she was capable of. He wanted to make sure that when she raised her hand in a briefing, someone would remember what happened the last time they didn't listen to her. He didn't want her actions to be buried in a classified file. He wanted them in her jacket where they could be seen. Emily looked at the mountain and thought about the grinding weight of the last 7 years, the excellence that went unacknowledged, the confidence that was mocked, the warnings that were ignored. She realized how much energy she had spent just maintaining her belief in herself while everyone else tried to tear it down. She had never doubted her own ability, not for a second. She had only doubted the system's ability to see it. Her grandfather's inheritance, the patience and the rifle, was the one thing no one could take from her. She thanked Mercer for everything. After a moment, he asked her a question. He wanted to know if she had been scared when she made that decision to turn east at the canyon entrance. She gave him the honest answer. She had been scared not of the climb or the mission, but of being wrong. She had been terrified that she had misread the situation, that the canyon was safe, and that she had destroyed her career on a mistake. But she added she had been more certain than she was scared. And when you are choosing between those 2 things, you have to go with the certainty. Mercer nodded, the weight of his own 11 deployments in his voice. He admitted that was the entire job in one sentence. He confessed that he had gone with the wrong certainty the morning before. He hadn't just lacked evidence, he had chosen to ignore the evidence she was offering him. He had closed the folder. It was a devastating admission, a statement of character made in the quiet of the desert. He promised he wouldn't do it again, not just to her, but to himself. The sun was sinking low, turning the mountains into silhouettes of gold and amber. The harshness of the day was softening into something beautiful. Emily looked at Hill 351 last time, the place that had held her up when she needed it and let her go when she was done. She thought of her grandfather again. She was 4 feet, 9 inches tall. She had carried 68 pounds of gear up a vertical wall in the dark. She had fired 9 perfect shots through a storm at a range of 3,500 meters. She had done it alone, and she had done it because she was the only one who could. She hadn't been assigned the role. She had spent 7 years becoming the person the moment required. Mercer turned to go back inside, but he stopped and looked back. He told her that tomorrow they would begin planning the actual mission, the hostage extraction they had come here for in the first place. He told her he wanted her at the table, not behind it, not at the end of it, but at the table. Emily heard everything he was saying in those few words. She told him she'd be there. As he walked away, she stayed for 1 more minute in the cooling air, watching the world decide what it was going to be now that the storm had passed. Specialist Emily Carter, the woman they had called a child, a doll, a mistake, straightened her shoulders. She turned her back on the mountain and walked back into the base. She had always been tall enough. She had just needed a mountain to prove it to everyone else.